Hello friends, welcome back to this last section of the module on suicide prevention counseling. In the earlier sections of the module, we studied suicide as a phenomenon. We also studied how suicide risk assessment is carried out, and finally, we studied some of the techniques that are used for counseling clients who are suicidal. The subject that is going to be dealt with in this section is about counseling people who have been bereaved by suicide. The term bereaved by suicide refers to people who have lost someone close to them to suicide. Just think for a moment about any incident of suicide that you have heard of. Did you naturally find yourself thinking about the family members of the person? Did you wonder how hard it might have been for them to cope up with the news of the suicide? It is clear that suicide does not only affect the person who decides to take their own life. When a person commits suicide, family members and friends are left in a state of shock and despair. Suicide thus affects a lot of people who are connected with the person who ends their own life. Hence, a significant part of the work that counselors do is with people who have been bereaved by suicide. Therefore, in this small section, we will focus on the ways and techniques that counselors use when they work with people who have lost a loved one to suicide. As we have already said, this type of counseling is called postvention. Loss, even in any normal circumstances, can leave the loved ones feeling sad, empty or helpless. This feeling of emptiness, as though a part of oneself has gone away with the dead person, a disruption in one's daily life, feeling disoriented and not having the energy to carry on with life, even to meet friends, is a common experience of many people. How much and for how long will a person mourn also depends on the bond that the person has experienced with the person who has passed away. Needless to say, the deeper the bond or the more the psychological connection, the more the person is going to be affected by the death. There is one more factor that also determines how a survivor can be affected by someone's death, and that factor is the circumstances of the death. If a loved one has lived a long, satisfying life and has passed away peacefully without much suffering, the survivors are bound to be much less affected than if the person has suffered a lot or has died early or in a shocking way. A young person dying in an accident, for example, will leave friends and family shocked, scared and feeling sorry much more than the kind of death described before. Similarly, if a young person dies due to a serious illness that went undetected, chances are that people left behind might keep feeling guilty about not having been more alert to the signs of the illness or for not having sought treatment in time. Such feelings last for a very long time, sometimes even for years in the survivors. Let us examine the various ways in which a person bereaved by suicide is differently affected by the circumstances of the loved one's death. Firstly, many people who are left behind are shocked and puzzled by the death of the loved one. Many times, those who end their lives never talk about their devastating mental state in the days before they take this drastic step. And so, the people left behind are kept seeking for an explanation of the death. Sometimes, for several months, the survivors may struggle hard to make sense of the death. In most other losses, the survivors have some explanation or they can attribute the death to particular causes. For example, when a person succumbs to a terminal illness, the survivors may explain the death as a consequence of the fact that no treatment was available for the disease. Or if a person dies of liver cirrhosis, survivors may blame the person's alcoholism. But when someone kills themselves, the obvious question is, why would they want to do it? It is the intentionality of the act that leaves people shocked. Suicide goes contrary to our widely and commonly held assumption that everyone obviously wants to live. And so, suicidal death can be perplexing, confusing and destabilizing for the survivors. Secondly, they may experience a lot of guilt. Was it something that they did or did not do that made the loved one feel wronged or not understood? Imagine a situation where a young person has had a bitter argument with their parents the night before, and the very next day they commit suicide. Isn't it natural for the parents to feel terribly guilty? As though they could have avoided this event had they not fought with their child. This kind of guilt might also be very difficult to undo as the person is now gone and there is no way they can apologize or make up for their mistakes. They may feel responsible for the death, and this can be a severely disturbing phenomenon for many people. In other circumstances, family members may not have had an argument or any bitterness with the loved one who committed suicide. Even if they do not feel personally responsible for causing unbearable pain and suffering for the loved one to the point that they took their own life, they may feel that they failed somehow to reach out to the person in time, and that had they been more careful and sensitive, they could have prevented the person from taking this ultimate step. Thirdly, suicide is a highly stigmatized way of death. The people left behind may find it very shameful to openly accept that it was a suicide. They may go to great lengths to hide the fact that it was suicide. This may also put a lot of pressure on them, and grieving becomes difficult because they are not able to talk about the death. Another complicating factor is that friends, family and other people in the community to whom they are connected may stop talking to them or slowly distance themselves from a person who has been bereaved. This disconnection can be emotionally very difficult for the bereaved person. Often, the news of a loved person having died of suicide is so shocking that the survivor begins to experience symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. Commonly, they experience vivid images in which the ghastly experience is relived. For a few moments, the survivor may feel as though the whole sequence of events is happening again. They may feel disoriented and extremely scared. Even if they try not to think about the death, these images and thoughts come back intrusively and spontaneously. The person can become so terrified of these thoughts and images that they may try to avoid anything that is likely to re-trigger these memories. Thus, they may avoid places associated with the person's death, people who remind them of the lost person, songs, sounds, or even a mention of the person. They may experience physiological arousal, especially elevated heart rate, blood pressure, and other physical symptoms of anxiety. They may spend hours not wanting to do anything, and even participating in routine day-to-day activities may become very difficult. They may startle easily and may become irritable. Finally, a bereaved person might start entertaining thoughts of suicide themselves. They may blame themselves for the death of the loved one and believe that the only way to absolve themselves of the guilt is to end their own life. It is not uncommon for survivors to feel suicidal and even attempt suicide themselves. One of the reasons that bereaved people go through this phase of feeling devastated is that the assumptions on which they had lived their lives until this event happened are now entirely disrupted. For instance, if a mother loses a child to suicide, the assumption that I know my child fully well, on which her psychological world rested before, is now no longer true. Or an assumption like I can keep my loved ones safe from harm is suddenly disrupted because of a shocking death. These are some of the prominent ways in which a bereaved person is affected by the suicidal death of a loved one. After having understood how the grief experienced by a bereaved person is different from any other loss, we will now try to understand how counselors try to deal with clients bereaved by suicide. We will try and understand the general goals that counselors keep in mind while dealing with these clients and also the techniques that they use while counseling. First and foremost, counselors want to help the client to contain the trauma and gain a sense of safety. As we have seen before, the trauma of the death can leave the survivor feeling numb and terrified. they may experience PTSD symptoms. Counselors often help clients to work through this phase of trauma by holding a safe space and allowing them enough time to cry, shake, tremble, and narrate the incident as well as their feelings over and over again. Secondly, counselors try to be understanding of the fact that the survivor's psychological world has been damaged because the assumptions on which they lived no longer hold true. That is why a repair of the mourner's assumptive world is necessary. Survivors may be shattered because the death that happened contradicted one of their long held beliefs about their own goodness. For example, a parent whose child has committed suicide may feel horrified because they always thought that they cared for their child and that they were wonderful parents, and the death proved it all wrong. They may be plunged into nagging self-doubts about their own goodness. Hence, it is important to help clients rebuild an honest and realistic explanation or narrative for the death. Honest dialogues with the counselor can help the client to see what all factors had come together for the suicide to happen. Such narratives make the whole event of the death more bearable rather than just blaming oneself or believing that the incident was all one's own fault. Thirdly, counselors work towards preventing the client from being totally consumed by the grief. The experience of losing someone to suicide is extremely painful, and many survivors say that this is the most devastating experience of their whole life. Hence, in the initial stages of mourning, they may be completely consumed by grief. But with time, they learn to grieve in a more controlled way. With the support of the counselor, they learn to allow their grief to surface at certain times, but when the situation is not appropriate, they learn to compartmentalize their grief so that they can pay attention to other tasks in their life. As normal life slowly resumes, the survivors need to have a relationship with the deceased person. The suicidal death may have left the survivor feeling as though the relationship has ended. Worse still, the survivor might be left feeling guilty or angry with the person for such an exit or betrayal. These feelings need to be worked through so that the survivor experiences these continuing bonds with the loved one. Helping the client to have some form of dialogue with the deceased and thus to find closure to their unfinished business is an important task in counseling survivors. Counselors make use of techniques like encouraging the client to write letters to the deceased, or using the empty chair technique, in which they imagine the deceased person there and have the liberty to fully express unexpressed feelings. The aim of these techniques is to restore a relationship with the loved one so that while the survivor resumes life, they know that the loved one will always be a part of their life. In the early stages of mourning, many people do not feel like meeting friends or socializing. They may be shunned and condemned by people in the community and naturally feel ashamed and compelled to hide the fact that the death was a suicide. Sometimes they may blame family members and intense interpersonal rage and conflict may follow. Often, family members do not know how to handle the need of grieving of a survivor, resulting in misunderstandings and withdrawing emotionally from each other. Counselors help client to work through all these interpersonal issues, thus moving towards closer and more meaningful relationships. Finally, counselors work to help clients to begin to reinvest their energy in living. They may have gone through a suicidal phase themselves. Slowly, however, they need to find reasons to continue living. Finding a sense of meaning or purpose of living is one of the most important tasks of mourning. The presence of a counselor can be of great help for people to begin to see reasons for living and to begin to live their life in meaningful ways again. Often, Support groups for bereaved people are set up, and such groups can provide the much needed safety, acceptance, and space for the survivor to deal with the harrowing experience of bearing the loss of a loved one. So, with this, friends, we come to the end of this module on survivors counseling. Thank you.